Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're plunging into really one of the most talked about legal cases of the year, the federal criminal trial of Sean Diddy Combs. Our mission for this deep dive is to unpack the complex verdict, understand the charges, and explore the far-reaching implications, giving you a comprehensive understanding of what just happened.
Yeah, absolutely. We've been watching weeks of pretty intense testimony, the intricate details of the charges, and then that jury's final decision on Wednesday, July 2, 2025, right there in Manhattan federal court. You've probably seen the headlines, but we're going to try and go beyond them, really dig into the nuance of what actually transpired.
Okay, let's unpack this. The legal saga for Sean Combs, I mean, for many people, it really seemed to start unfolding with that bombshell civil lawsuit. Can you walk us through how that initial filing, and especially how quickly it was settled, sort of acted as a catalyst?
Right, that swift escalation, it just immediately broadened the scope. What's crucial here, I think, is understanding how fast a civil matter turned into a full-blown federal criminal investigation. So, back in November 2023, Cassie Ventura Combs' former long-term partner, she filed the civil lawsuit. It had really graphic accusations, sexual abuse, physical violence, coercive control, spanning like a decade.
Wow, okay.
And then almost immediately, that lawsuit was settled out of court, like within 24 hours. Now, while a lot of people saw that as maybe an attempt to contain the crisis, you could argue it actually had the opposite effect.
Right.
How so?
Well, it seems like Ventura's action kind of emboldened others.
Yeah.
Because over the next few months, you saw this cascade of civil lawsuits popping up. More allegations, sexual assault, harassment, even systematic human trafficking, forced drug use, these explicit freak-off parties people talked about.
So it's quite a leap, though, from a quickly settled civil suit to, federal agents raiding his homes. What really pushed it into the criminal investigation territory? Yeah, it was the sheer volume, I think, and the really serious nature of those civil claims that truly caught the attention of federal authorities. So then by March 2024, you had Homeland Security investigations, HSI, agents executing these very public search warrants, Combs' places in LA and Miami.
I remember seeing that footage. It was everywhere.
Exactly. Viral videos, federal agents swarming the properties. I mean, that's a pretty clear signal, right? A serious criminal investigation is underway. Then, fast forward to September 2024, a federal grand jury unseals a multi-count indictment against Combs. And then, just weeks before the trial was set to start, April 2025, prosecutors filed what's called a superseding indictment. That brought the total counts to 5. Combs, naturally, through his legal team, Mark Agnifilo, Christina Coram pleaded not guilty to everything.
Okay, so let's zero in on those charges because they were heavy hitters. For someone like Diddy facing a racketeering charge under ICO, that must have been huge. Let's really break down what ICO actually means here.
Yeah, the prosecution's approach with Count 1, racketeering conspiracy, well, it involved weaving together this really complex story. This was probably the most significant charge they brought forward. Because RICO, it's different. It doesn't just target one crime. It's designed to dismantle an entire criminal enterprise by proving a pattern of these predicate acts underlying serious crimes like, sex trafficking, drug dealing, extortion, things like that.
So it's about the whole operation, not just isolated incidents.
Precisely. And the very fact they chose to use RICO, I mean, this is a law historically used against, the mafia, it really tells you what the prosecution was aiming for. They wanted to portray Combs not just as, someone who allegedly committed crimes, but as the head of this whole criminal machine. But choosing RICO also meant they set a really high bar for themselves, proof-wise, and the stakes. Immense. We're talking potential life in prison, huge asset forfeiture.
Okay, so beyond the massive RICO charge, what else was he facing?
Right. So beyond RICO, there were 2 counts of sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion. These came directly from allegations made by Cassandra Ventura and another woman identified just as Jane. Now, sex trafficking law, basically, it prohibits making someone engage in commercial sex acts using force, fraud, or coercion. A conviction there carries a mandatory minimum sentence, 15 years, and it could go up to life.
15 years minimum.
Wow. And then finally, there were 2 counts of transportation to engage in prostitution. These are violations of the Mann Act. These also involve Cassandra Ventura and Jane. The Mann Act, it's formally called the White Slave Traffic Act, but basically it makes it a federal crime to transport someone across state lines or international borders for any immoral purpose, which includes prostitution. A conviction on those counts carries a maximum of 10 years in prison per count.
Okay, so 7 weeks of trial. Intense proceedings, you mentioned graphic testimony. How did the prosecution actually try to prove all this? And what was the defense strategy against such serious charges?
Yeah, the Diddy trial, it was definitely one of the most closely watched cases of 2025. The prosecution, they brought in over 30 witnesses, including, as you said, really explosive and frankly graphic testimony from Cassandra Ventura and Jane. Their accounts were very emotional, detailing alleged abuse, manipulation, coercion, all happening within Combs' kind of inner circle. The prosecution's main argument was that Combs used his vast network, his resources, to enable and hide years of these alleged illicit activities.
And the defense, what was their play?
The defense team, Agnifilo and Coram, they went with a strategy of, well, non-cooperation, you could say. They chose not to call any witnesses, not Combs, not anyone else. For anyone listening, who isn't deep into legal strategy, this often aims to basically force the prosecution to prove their case entirely on their own merits, without the defense giving them anything extra to work with or cross-examine.
So they put all their energy into attacking the prosecution's case.
Exactly. They focused heavily on aggressive cross-examinations of the prosecution witnesses. They were trying to discredit the testimony, point out any inconsistencies they could find, and basically paint a picture that maybe these were consensual activities or recreational drug use that got twisted or misrepresented. Their core argument, repeated throughout, was simple. The prosecution just hadn't met that incredibly high standard of beyond a reasonable doubt needed for a criminal conviction.
Okay, so after all that, more than 2 days of deliberation, the jury comes back, July 2nd, 2025. And it's reported as a partial verdict.
Beware.
What does that actually mean for you, our listener, and what was the final breakdown from the jury?
Yeah, the journey to that verdict wasn't totally straightforward for the jury, it seems. A partial verdict, or sometimes called a split verdict. It just means they reached a unanimous decision on some of the counts, but maybe not all initially. In this specific case, reports suggested they had some difficulty, particularly with the complex Argio charge, but ultimately they did reach a consensus on all 5 counts. And the results were striking. Combs was acquitted, found not guilty on count 1, the big racketeering conspiracy charge.
That's huge for him.
Absolutely massive. Also not guilty on count 2, sex trafficking involving Cassandra Ventura, and count 4, sex trafficking involving Jane. I mean, this was a profound legal victory for Combs and his team. It took the possibility of a life sentence off the table, avoided that huge potential asset forfeiture tied to RICO. That not guilty verdict basically means the prosecution failed to convince all 12 jurors beyond a reasonable doubt on those really broad, really severe charges.
And it wasn't a complete acquittal.
No, not at all. He was found guilty on 2 counts. Count 3, transportation to engage in prostitution involving Cassandra Ventura, and count 5, transportation to engage in prostitution involving Jane. So on those counts, the jury did believe the prosecution proved its case. They believed beyond a reasonable doubt that he transported these individuals across state lines specifically for the purpose of prostitution, violating the Mann Act.
Right, so the question everyone's asking, is Diddy free? What's his situation right now, and what does this verdict really mean for his future?
Yeah, his legal status changed dramatically right after that verdict. Reports said Combs showed, visible relief in the courtroom, which makes sense. Before the trial, remember, he'd been denied bail. There were concerns about witness tampering. So he was actually being held at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn since his arrest back in September 2024.
So was he released immediately after the verdict?
Well, his exact status right then, whether he was remanded back into custody or released on bail, pending sentencing, that would have depended on the judge's ruling, Judge Arun Subramanian, right at that moment. But even if he was released on bail, let's be clear, he's definitely not free from the judgment or the sentence that's coming.
Okay, so the focus shifts to sentencing now.
Exactly. That's the next major step. Judge Subramanian will set a date for the sentencing hearing. For each of those Mann Act convictions, the maximum sentence is 10 years in prison. Importantly, there's no mandatory minimum sentence for the Mann Act.
So the judge has a lot of discretion.
A fair amount, yes. The judge will look at the federal sentencing guidelines. Combs' lack of prior criminal history is relevant, but also the specific details of these crimes that came out in the trial. The judge has to decide, how much jail time Diddy will actually get within that 0 to 10-year range for each count. And crucially, whether those sentences will run concurrently at the same time or consecutively, one after the other.
Which could mean up to 20 years, potentially.
Potentially, yes, if served consecutively at the maximum. Though that might be unlikely, it's technically possible. And this is really critical to remember. The criminal verdict doesn't end things. not by a long shot. There are still numerous civil lawsuits pending against Combs.
Right, those cases that sort of started it all.
Exactly. And civil cases operate under a different, lower burden of proof. It's called preponderance of the evidence, basically meaning more likely than not. It's much lower than beyond a reasonable doubt. So even though he was acquitted of criminal sex trafficking, civil lawsuits alleging similar conduct can and almost certainly will proceed. And those could lead to significant monetary damages, regardless of the criminal outcome.
Yeah, that makes sense. This whole case just captivated everyone, didn't it? Media outlets, constant coverage. What does this deep dive really tell us about maybe the justice system itself, public perception, and holding powerful people accountable?
It really does highlight some complex issues when you step back and look at the bigger picture. First, definitely the burden of proof. This split verdict, it just throws into sharp relief that huge difference between, widespread public allegations fueled by lots of civil suits and what it actually takes to prove a criminal case, especially complex ones like RICO, beyond a reasonable doubt against a well-defended individual. It's a real lesson in those different standards.
Yeah, the legal bar is just so high.
It really is. Second, there's that potential disconnect between public perception and the legal outcome. Public opinion gets shaped by all the allegations, the headlines, the civil cases, but a criminal jury has very specific rules and evidence they have to follow, so the verdict might not line up with what many people believe happened. And third, power and accountability. The trial really put under a microscope the extent to which really powerful figures like Sean Combs, immense wealth, influence, huge networks, can they be held accountable for things allegedly happening within those networks? I think the very fact that he was subjected to such a public criminal trial, regardless of the mixed verdict, is pretty significant in itself.
This deep dive really has peeled back the layers on a complicated case. It shows just how intricate the legal system can be, especially with high-profile figures, intense public scrutiny, all of it. That verdict on July 2nd, 2025, it's definitely a pivotal moment. But it's clearly not the final chapter in Sean Diddy Combs' legal story.
No, definitely not. His acquittal on those most severe charges, RFU and sex trafficking, that's a huge legal win for him. It saves him from potential life imprisonment, saves his financial empire from being potentially dismantled by RICO. But those two guilty verdicts on the Mann Act counts, they're serious felonies. He is facing a significant prison sentence.
And like you said, beyond the criminal side, all those civil lawsuits are still there, looming, promising more legal fights, more public attention for, likely, years.
Yeah, the case of Sean Diddy Combs, it's become this really compelling and often, frankly, disturbing story. It kind of encapsulates so many complex themes: fame, power, alleged abuse, accountability, all playing out right now in the 21st century.
So for you, our listener, maybe here's something to think about as we wrap up. How might those different burdens of proof, the high bar in criminal court versus the lower bar in civil court, continue to shape the narrative? And maybe even the legacy of figures like Sean Combs long after the criminal courts have had their say.